This video is based on portions of Isis Unveiled by H.P. Blavatsky, published in 1877. I have listed a link in the description box in the comment section below for a free ebook. Section 2, Chapter 3, Religion and the Lies They Told. Clement describes Basilides, the Gnostic, as, quote, a philosopher devoted to the contemplation of divine things, end quote. This very appropriate expression may be applied to many of the founders of the more important sects, which later were all engulfed in one, that stupendous compound of unintelligible dogmas enforced by Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others, which is now termed Christianity. And if these must be called heresies, then early Christianity itself must be included in the number. Basilides and Valentinius preceded Irenaeus and Tertullian, and the two latter fathers had less facts than the two former Gnostics to show that their heresy was plausible. Neither divine right nor truth brought about the triumph of their Christianity, but fate alone was beneficial. We can assert with entire plausibility that there is not one of these sects, Kabbalism, Judaism, and our present Christianity included, but they all sprung from the two main branches of that one mother trunk. The once universal religion, which antedated the Vedic rages, we speak of that prehistoric Buddhism, which later merged into Brahmanism, and the religion which the primitive teaching of the early few apostles most resembled, a religion preached by Jesus himself, is the elder of these two, Buddhism. The latter is taught in its primitive purity and carried to perfection by the last of the Buddhas, Gautama. Based its moral ethics on these three fundamental principles, and alleges the following. 1. Everything exists from natural causes. 2. That virtue brings its own reward, and vice and sin their own punishment. And 3. That the state of man in this world is probationary. We might add that on these three principles rested the universal foundation of every religious creed: God and individual immortality for every man, if he could but win it. However puzzling the subsequent theological tenets, however seemingly incomprehensible the metaphysical abstractions which has convulsed the theology of every one of the great religions of mankind, as soon as it was placed on a sure footing, the above is found to be the essence of every religious philosophy, with exception of the latter Christianity. It was that of Zoroaster, of Pythagoras, of Plato, of Jesus, and even of Moses, albeit the teaching of the Jewish lawgiver have been so piously tampered with. We will devote the present chapter mainly to a brief survey of the numerous sects which have recognized themselves as Christians. That is to say, that they have believed in a Christos, or an, quote, anointed one, end quote. We will also endeavor to explain the latter appellation from the Kabbalistic standpoint and show it reappearing in every religious system. It might be profitable, at the same time, to see how much the earliest apostles, Paul and Peter, agreed in their preaching of the new dispensation, and we will begin with Peter. And we must once more return to that greatest of all the patrist frauds, the one which has undeniably helped the Roman Catholic Church to its unmerited supremacy, i.e., the barefaced assertion in the teeth of historical evidence that Peter suffered martyrdom at Rome. It is but too natural that the Latin clergy would cling to it, For with the exposure of the fraudulent nature of this pretext, the dogma of apostolic succession must fall to the ground. There have been many able works and writings of late in the refutation of this preposterous claim, noting that Mr. George Reber's The Christ of Paul, which overthrows it quite ingeniously. The author proves that 1. There was no church established at Rome until the reign of Antonius Pius. 2. That, as Eusebius and Irenaeus both agree, that Linus was the second bishop of Rome, into whose hands, quote, the blessed apostles, end quote, Peter and Paul committed the church after building it. It could not have been at any other time than between 64 and 68 AD. And 3, that this interval of years happens during the reign of Nero, for Eusebius states that Linus held this office 12 years, entering upon it 69 AD, 1 year after the death of Nero, and then dying himself in 81. After that, the author maintains, on very solid grounds, that Peter could not have been in Rome 64 AD, for he was at that time in Babylon, wherefrom he wrote his first epistle, the date of which is fixed by Dr. Lardner and other critics at precisely this year. But we believe that his best argument is in proving that it was not in the character of the cowardly Peter to risk himself in such close neighborhood with Nero, who was, quote, feeding the wild beasts of the amphitheater with the flesh and bones of Christians, end quote, during that time. Perhaps then the Church of Rome was but consistent in choosing as for her titular founder the apostle who thrice denied his master. At the moment of danger, and the only one moreover except Judas, who provoked Christ in such a way as to be addressed as the enemy. "Get thee behind me, Satan," exclaims Jesus, rebuking the taunting apostle. But there is a tradition in the Greek Church which has never found favor at the Vatican. The former traces its origin to one of the Gnostic leaders, Basilides, perhaps who lived under Trajan and Adrian at the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century. With regard to this particular tradition, if the Gnostic is Basilides, then he must be accepted as the sufficient authority, having claimed to have been a disciple of the Apostle Matthew, and have to have for a master Glaucias, as a disciple of St. Peter himself, where the narrative attributed to him authenticated the London Committee for the Revision of the Bible would have had to add new verses to Matthew, Mark, and John, who tell the story of Peter's denial of Christ. This tradition, then, of which we have been speaking, affirms that when frightened at the accusation of a servant of the high priest, the apostle had thrice denied his master, and the cock had crowed. Jesus, who was then passing through the hall in custody of the soldiers, turned, and looking at Peter, he said, quote, "Verily I say unto thee, Peter, thou shalt deny me throughout the coming ages, and never stop until thou shalt be old, and shalt stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee, and carry thee whither thou wouldest not." End quote. The latter part of this sentence, say the Greeks, relates to the Church of Rome, and prophesies her constant apostasy from Christ under the mask of a false religion. Later it was inserted into the 21st chapter of John, but the whole of this chapter had been pronounced a forgery even before it was found that the Gospel had never in fact been written by the Apostle John at all. The anonymous author of the supernatural religion a work which in 2 years passed through several editions, and which is alleged to have been written by an eminent theologian, proves conclusively that the spuriousness of the 4 Gospels, or at least their complete transformation in the hand of the too zealous Irenaeus and his champions. The 4th Gospel is completely upset by this able author. The extraordinary forgeries of the fathers of the early centuries are plainly demonstrated, and the relative value of the synoptics is discussed with an unprecedented power of logic. The work carries conviction in its every line. From it quote the following, quote, "We gain infinitely more than we lose in abandoning belief in the reality of divine revelation. Whilst we retain pure and unimpaired the treasure of Christian morality, we relinquish nothing but the debasing elements added to it by human superstition. We are no longer bound to believe a theology which outrages reason and moral sense. We are freed from base anthropomorphic views of God and his government of the universe, and from Jewish mythology we rise to higher conceptions of an infinitely wise and beneficent being, hidden from our finite minds, it is true, in the impenetrable glory of divinity, but whose laws of wondrous comprehensiveness and perfection we ever perceive in operation around us. The argument so often employed by theologians that divine revelation is necessary for man, and that certain views contained in that revelation are required for our moral consciousness. It's purely imaginary and derived from the revelation which it seeks to maintain. The only thing absolutely necessary for man is truth, and to that alone must our moral consciousness adapt itself." End quote. We will consider farther in what light was regarded the divine revelation of the Jewish Bible by the Gnostics, who yet believed in Christ in their own way, a far better and less blasphemous one than the Roman Catholics. The Fathers have forced on the believers in Christ a Bible, the laws prescribed in which he was the first to break, the teachings of which he utterly rejected, and for which crimes he was finally crucified. Of whatever else the Christian world can boast, it can hardly claim logic and consistency as its chief virtues. The fact alone that Peter remained to the last an, quote, apostle of the circumcision, end quote, speaks for itself. Whosoever else might have built the Church of Rome, but not Peter. If such were the case, the successors of this apostle would have to submit themselves to circumcision, if it were for but the sake of consistency and to show that the claims of the popes are not utterly groundless. Dr. Inman asserts that the report says that, quote, "In our Christian times, popes have to be privately perfect," end quote. But we do not know whether it is carried to the extent of the Levitical Jewish law. The first 15 Christian bishops of Jerusalem, commencing with James and including Judas, were all circumcised Jews. Within the Sefer Toldos Jeshu, a Hebrew manuscript of great antiquity, the version about Peter is quite different. Simon Peter, it says, was one of their own brethren, though he had somewhat departed from the laws, and the Jewish hatred and persecution of the apostles seems to have existed, but only in the fecund imagination of the fathers. The author speaks of him with great respect and fairness, calling him a faithful servant of the living God, who passed his life in austerity and meditation, quote, living in Babylon at the summit of a tower, end quote, composing hymns and preaching charity. He also adds that Peter always recommended to the Christians not to molest the Jews. But as soon as he was dead, behold, another preacher went to Rome and pretended that Simon Peter had altered the teachings of his master. He invented a burning hell and threatened everyone with it, promised miracles, but worked none. How much there is in the previous of fiction and how much of truth, it is for others to decide. But it certainly bears more the evidence of sincerity and fact on its face than do the fables concocted by the fathers to answer their ends. We may the more readily credit this friendship between Peter and his late co-religionists, as we find in the Theodoret the following assertion, quote, "The Nazarenes are Jews honoring the anointed Jesus as a just man and using the evangel according to Peter." Peter too was a Nazarene according to the Talmud. He belonged to the sect of the later Nazarenes, which dissented from the followers of John the Baptist and then became a rival sect, and which, as tradition goes, which originally was instituted by Jesus himself. End of Part 1, Chapter 3. Watch for Part 2, The Magic of the Nazarenes, the Good Magicians and the Bad Magicians. Until the next time, love yourselves and love each other unconditionally.